Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, racial hiring at CBC, a war criminal gunned down in Canada, and why the government doesn't want you to know how much it's spending to fight against your rights.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Andrew Lawton Show, Canada's most irreverent talk show here on True North. It's great to have you aboard this program as we talk about the latest development in the race wars. We talk all the time now, everyone, the media, corporate world, academics, everyone's talking about how we need to purge ourselves of unconscious bias. We need to eradicate systemic racism. We have to purge anything within our institutions that fosters racism. But then CBC comes along, and in the name of doing that, in the name of purging itself of systemic racism, actually puts a new racial litmus test into its job postings. This is a press release from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, from CBC, as part of its so-called working group on racism and bias in Canada's state broadcaster. This is the broadcaster that gets $1.3 billion of your taxpayer money. Which means the decisions that CBC makes are not just about some private company deciding a path forward, but basically what the government is doing, what a group that is backed by and exists only because of the government is doing. And what CBC's group has come up with is a list of promises, basically, or commitments or quota that will guide the CBC moving forward. And one of these is incredibly absurd. This is a direct quote. Half of all new hires for executive and senior management positions will be Indigenous people, visible minorities, or people with disabilities, and retention and promotion rates for people from these three groups will be doubled. So if they look at people within these groups and find this is the rate at which they're getting promoted, they have to double that rate, which means that promotions are all of a sudden going to be racially motivated. And also the fact that they're only going to be hiring people in senior roles if they are half of them in these groups that were just laid out. So that's part of it. And then also you look further down and they're going to make unconscious bias training mandatory for people, leading people, including senior management, and available on demand to any employee. Now, I'm going to get to the unconscious bias part a bit later on, but I want to focus on this initial diversity-based hiring and diversity-based promotion. You see, when I first ran through this, I had missed the promotion part because I was just so aghast at the first bullet point there, that half of new hires for these executive positions will be Indigenous, visible minorities, or people with disabilities. And there are a few different parts of this, and I want to read the rationale that CBC has provided here, because this came in a press release that hasn't gotten much media attention. I tweeted it out. I know there were a couple of articles about it, but then a lot of people started getting nasty with me because they thought that I was announcing the policy. They thought that I was a CBC personality, which is pretty much the most offensive thing anyone's ever thought about me. But there was a statement from Catherine Tate, who's the president and CEO of CBC Radio-Canada. She says, "We recognize that systemic racism exists in Canada and within many of its institutions, including its national public broadcaster. We are committed to combating racism in all its forms, to removing structural barriers and practices that result in discrimination at CBC Radio-Canada, and to improve our workplace culture in tangible, concrete ways. We know these issues aren't new. People have been raising concerns for a long time, and our responses haven't worked fast enough. So we're going to tackle things differently and intensify the transformation of our organization so that we are truly inclusive and representative of contemporary Canada." Now, I mean, there's a lot of the standard mumbo-jumbo corporate speak in there that we can all do better. It's very Trudeaupian. We know that racism exists. Every institution's affected by it, including CBC. But when they say that they're combating racism in all its forms, the answer to that is not implementing a racial litmus test, which is a flawed idea for two reasons. Number one, Merit-based hiring is, if you're an organization, the top priority because you want to make sure that the people you're promoting, the people you're hiring are good at their jobs. This is not at all to say that people who are visible minorities or people with disabilities are not good at their jobs, but it's to say that if you make competence your top priority, nothing else factors in. Nothing else factors in. If you're making competence your number one priority, the other things should not matter at all. Now, if you are talking about having a range of backgrounds, I think there is an approach there that would be valuable, but not ethnic backgrounds, more outlook. Hey, someone who grew up in a city is already on your team and you have a new job. Here's someone who grew up in rural Canada. Having an Indigenous perspective can be valuable, especially when it comes to programming or content. But when you are talking about executive senior management positions, they're not talking about a diversity of opinions here. They're not talking about a range of backgrounds to make sure that everyone doesn't think the same way. They're talking about quotas. And the reason you know that is because they are talking about visible minorities. If it was just about, we want to make sure that, we're serving Canada by having people of all different backgrounds and types in our team, it wouldn't matter if you were a visible minority or not. I mean, someone who's Jewish is part of a group that is still the number one targeted group of hate crimes in Canada, anti-Semitic hate crimes and anti-Semitic hateful graffiti and vandalism more than any other group. But a lot of Jewish people would not qualify for this because they are not visible minorities. It was actually a Jewish friend of mine who pointed this out yesterday when this whole thing came out. So you have to be a visible minority. You can't just be an invisible minority. And there's now a racial litmus test. So to be at CBC, you have a better chance of getting hired, or if you are a minority than not, because CBC has instituted a quota system. And the whole point here that I think needs to be understood, when they say half, that is a quota. That is not, we just want to keep an eye out and be mindful. That is a measurable target. It's quantifiable, which may be great for ensuring that they've done their part in a couple of years by the time this is supposed to be in effect. But it is, in fact, a quota system. And when they say they're doing it by 2021, 2022, I find that to be a bit hilarious, too. If you're going to put a quota in and you say that you're going to prioritize these sorts of racial and ethnic metrics for hiring, why not put it in now? Why not say, all right, the next person we hire, we're starting this up. And, it's a coin toss, whether we're up for, maybe they'll do it like U.S. senators, where, there are two senators in each state, the senior senator and the junior senator. And every 6 years, one of them is up for election at the time that the other one isn't. So what they can do is then say, oh, no, it's up for, we have to do a minority hire now. Nope, we're in non-minority hire again. And that's the inherent absurdity of this. But when you talk about retention and promotion rates, now this is hugely, hugely concerning. And they don't say whether these retention and promotion rates are referring to just people in those executive and senior management positions, or if it's across the board. If it's across the board, this now means that, Joe producer or Jane producer or Joe anchor, Jane anchor, they are at a higher likelihood of getting promoted if they are a minority, because CBC has again instituted this test that means these groups have to be in a demonstrable and quantifiable way hired and promoted more frequently. And this is something that for a lot of people, if you accept the narrative that CBC is a systemically racist institution, by the way, CBC, which had Geyn Ghomeshi, forget about Geyn Ghomeshi's later years, but Geyn Ghomeshi on, who was an Iranian Canadian in a flagship show. They have their anchor chairs of the National, which were initially involving an Asian man and a South Asian man. You have people from many minority backgrounds across the board in positions at CBC. So there is representation. And you look at that CBC Kids recap show that I talked about last week, where they were slamming J.K. Rowling. Again, you had 3 co-hosts on that. 1 was black and 2 were Asian. So there is representation on air. Whether there is behind the scenes or not, I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time, gratefully, wandering the corporate halls of CBC on Front Street. But to say that this is a racist organization when they have already gone out of their way, by their own admission, to hire non-white people to be the face of CBC, and this was that CBC Kids posting. I know I've mentioned it the last couple of shows, but it was very telling. When they were hiring for a job and they said no Caucasians allowed, they eventually apologized for that when they got caught. But that was the approach. So to say that CBC is racist is, I think, a bit interesting, because they've already been doing a lot of these concerns. I know job postings at CBC, like most other corporate institutions and government institutions in Canada, always allow you to voluntarily tick off that box when you're applying that says you are a visible minority, a person with disability, etc. This is just standard practice, and in some cases, they even ask you about sexual orientation in these things. I don't know if CBC does, but other institutions do, including, there was one job a little while ago that someone flagged for me at the University of Toronto, not because they wanted me to apply for it. They just wanted me to see that this is what U of T was asking. And I'm like, well, wait, why does it matter if, they know if you're gay or bisexual or not, if, you're applying for a job, in the IT department or whatever it was. So all of this is to say that CBC has now made its environment a lot more race-conscious and race-focused by brazenly and overtly making hiring decisions predicated, at least in part, on race. And I want to go through a lot of the conversations that tend to happen when this topic comes up. It's affirmative action on steroids here. Because I say, okay, you need to make merit the first priority. And then someone else responds, oh, are you saying that visible minorities aren't worthy of being hired and don't have the skill sets? To which I say, no, you're being ridiculous and you're race baiting. What I'm saying is that if you make merit your top focus, you don't need to incorporate other things. And that's where the conversation tends to go off the rails. It's not to say that there aren't minorities that are entirely capable and are the best candidate. And that's the whole point of equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome. But if we go down this road, the people who suffer the most in this situation are the visible minorities who are incredibly great at their jobs, rise through the ranks, and then you breed resentment against these people because someone who doesn't get the promotion, who might just be a terrible employee and didn't deserve it, but happens to be a white male, is looking and saying, I wonder if they only got promoted because of this policy that CBC has put in place, vowing to double the promotion rates for people in these groups. So it calls into question anyone's success at CBC who happens to be in one of these groups, which means it's not just about ensuring that you are representative of the population you serve. It's about a lot more than that. It's about reprogramming the way people think, which is why unconscious bias training, the other part of this announcement, is something that I need to talk about for a few moments here, because they're making it mandatory for people that are in leadership roles. I don't know, senior management is a big group at CBC. I don't know where they're drawing the line of what senior is versus what just supervisory is. But they're committing better resources, they say, to retain and identify internal and external candidates from these groups. But the unconscious bias is also going to influence reporting, as well as the focus of the company itself, of CBC. But I was reading up about this because I've never actually had to go through this corporate diversity stuff, oddly. I worked for a giant media company, but somehow I managed to not have to do anything like this. I've had to do like copyright law training and stuff like that, but never unconscious bias training. And the thing was, I was reading it and I was fascinated by the fact that most of the criticisms of it that I found were not just from visible minorities, but were from visible minorities who work in the space of diversity and equity and equality. So very much social justice-minded visible minority people were criticizing unconscious bias training because they say it doesn't actually do anything. It says there's no idea, there's no research, there's no evidence to suggest that anything along this line reduces discrimination, reduces racism, or even contributes to anything of substance moving forward. And I want to read a couple of these because one is from Bloomberg, where a writer, Tomas Chamorro Premuzic, I'm butchering the name, and I apologize for that, talks about Google, Papa John's, Starbucks, all companies that have done implicit bias training. And they say there is no convincing scientific evidence that it works. In fact, much of the academic evidence on implicit bias interventions highlights their weakness as a method for boosting diversity and inclusion. Instructions to suppress stereotypes often have the opposite effect, and prejudice reduction programs are much more effective when people are already open-minded, altruistic, and concerned about their prejudices to begin with. And one of the papers that's cited here is an academic paper that looks at this called Pointless Diversity Training, Unconscious Bias, New Racism, and Agency. So the point here is that the type of people that are going to take these programs seriously are already doing what they can to combat prejudices and stereotypes. It does what I mentioned earlier with the quotas, whereas it turns people against those that they're supposed to be protecting against bias towards. And it just doesn't actually solve the underlying problems. And then I looked at why that is in a little bit more detail. And there were two pieces actually that came up. One of them I liked, don't do unconscious bias training. Now, this is from a group called Tidal Equality, which is a strategy firm at the intersection of social change and diversity and inclusion. So this is not from like a right-wing hate monger site, as some of the left would say. This is from a group that has a vested interest in tidal equality, as its name is. So like a tidal wave of social change and diversity and inclusion. And they say it's basically for companies to tick the box of unconscious bias training. They say these things are risk mitigation and compliance. They aren't there for people who experience and understand discrimination, but corporate lawyers. They say it doesn't work. It never includes the things that do work. And ultimately, all they've done is produce this thing that has no evidence anywhere that the awareness, which is all they're really doing, is leading to behavioral change. And Starbucks was hit for this a couple of years ago when Starbucks decided to shut down all of its stores. I don't know if it was worldwide or just in the U.S. I think Canada was included. All of its stores so that its employees could do a day-long seminar of unconscious bias training. And the reason for this was that two black Starbucks patrons were just minding their own business, and the cops had been called on them in Seattle, I think it was. And this happened, and the Starbucks store shut down. Starbucks surrenders what I would have to assume is millions of dollars in profits for a day because they want to take this seriously. And then everyone craps on Starbucks and says they're not going far enough because you can't unlearn lifelong biases in a day, and you need to do all these other things, and it has to be ongoing. And none of that really happens. A lot of the critics of these programs say. So these programs get more criticism from the left than they do from the right. Because it becomes about tokenism. It becomes about tokenism. And you look at what else CBC is doing here. They want to train inclusive newsrooms, the impact of unconscious bias on our content and reporting in Indigenous communities. Now, these are areas where I think there's a benefit to diversity. If someone's going to be reporting in an Indigenous community, it would be helpful for them to be Indigenous or to at least have an understanding of Indigenous issues. If someone is going to manage a team of Indigenous reporters, it would be helpful for them to have a background in that and have a connection, direct or indirect, with that culture. So I'm not anti-diversity. What I am is a proponent of the idea that diversity has to be organic. You can't manufacture it, you can't manipulate it, and if you do, it has to come at the expense of something else. It comes at the expense of cohesion, maybe it comes at the expense of merit, but it comes at the expense of something else if you choose to make diversity itself the goal. You know, there was a great line that I actually want to share with you about this, about the moral neutrality of diversity. It was from a sit-down interview I did, I think about a year ago, with Mark Stein. Take a look.
Well, you look at the now official catchphrase of Canada, diversity is our strength. I mean, that's the type of thing where if some politician says it, it might not mean anything, but that is actually guiding policy.
No, but diversity is our strength. I can't stand that because diversity is morally neutral. And you can have 5 nice ladies like Madame Arbour, 5 nice CBC listening ladies of d'un certain âge, who like to listen to CBC radio, and that group of 5 ladies d'un certain âge is not in the least bit diverse. So you add to them Sudan's leading clitoridectomy practitioner. And you've made it more diverse, but you haven't necessarily made it better. Diversity is an entirely morally neutral term. And simply saying diversity is our strength with a glassy-eyed expression because you've been told it ever since kindergarten does not actually make it so.
I think you should actually pitch that to like the replacement of The View, you know, Sudan's leading clitoridectomy specialist, Louise Arbour, and everyone else.
It would make that show a lot more interesting.
But you bring up...
Oh, actually, let's not start with The View. This cockamamie thing they've got on the National since Peter Mansbridge retired. They've got like 4 anchors carefully selected according to some CBC focus group thing. Sticks Sudan's leading clitoridectomy practitioner in the middle of the National as the 5th host.
I think that's a fantastic way of putting it. Just because something is more diverse does not make it better. And just because something has perhaps had a different perspective added to it on racial grounds doesn't make it better, doesn't make it more fair, doesn't make it more just, doesn't do any of these things. So again, I'm not anti-diversity. I'm certainly not anti people from different backgrounds and groups rising up. What I am an opponent of is the idea that we should create these racial lines that are used to define people, that are used for advancement, and that is somehow going to combat rather than generate and propagate racism at CBC or anywhere else. We've got to take a break. When we come back, more of The Andrew Lawton Show here on True North.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
You know, we were talking earlier about all the things that are now racist in 2020, everything, everyone. That's basically the gist of it. It's been a theme the last couple of episodes of the show. This story is not a new one. It's from 2019, but I've seen it recirculating a fair bit in the current context. It's a piece in The Independent in the UK that Mary Poppins is racist, as termed by a U.S. academic, because of the soot scene. The 1964 film has that famous scene which now is being likened with blackface and promoting racial stereotypes. Poor Julie Andrews, even though her face was just covered in soot. It was literally a show or a movie about chimney sweeps, but now even Mary Poppins is not safe from the racist purge or the racial purge of 2020. Poor Mary Poppins. And poor Dick Van Dyke. He's still alive and kicking, and so is Julie Andrews as well. And the two of them have actually done, I think, a great deal for entertainment, and now they are forced to see this, and this is how they'll be remembered now in the eyes of academia. Here's an interesting one as well. The RCMP fined 7 Americans last week for stopping to sightsee in Banff National Park. The sightseeing was while they were driving from the mainland, lower 48 United States to Alaska. Despite the border closure, you are allowed to drive from the United States to the United States if you live in Alaska or have a so-called essential reason for going there, but you need to take the most direct route. Well, that is a very beautiful part of North America, so I don't blame anyone, American or otherwise, who's driving by the Rockies to take a look and say, oh, well, this is kind of nice, we'll stop and maybe get out, especially knowing how safe it is to be outdoors, even with the pandemic fears. But the RCMP were saying, nope, if you are not there with a legitimate reason, you're getting ticketed. So if they were seeing U.S. plates, they were going after people. And again, I mean, these busybodies that were doing nothing other than endangering those who they said were breaking the rules, when the people that were getting ticketed weren't actually doing anything apart from enjoying the beauty of Canada, walking around outdoors, not causing a threat to anyone. So that's just absurd. And again, the sooner we get back to life as normal, the better it will be for everyone. This life as normal is not really something that's happened in my town. So many of you may know I'm from London, Ontario, lovely little city, very quiet city by and large. Despite having a big university and a big college here, it's kind of off the beaten path from Toronto stuff. So it was a little bit surprising when last week a West African warlord was executed, it appears, in my city of London, Ontario. Actually, not far from me in the grand scheme of things, because it's not a big city. This was a really weird thing. There was a home invasion and a man killed last week. That in and of itself is a bit rare in London. And then you read through it a little bit more and you find out that he was actually a former Liberian military general who was accused of just heinous war crimes, and who was a commander, it sounds like, was a general under a guy who's now behind bars for being a war criminal. And that was Charles Taylor that he was working under. And he was connected, there's no doubt, to the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, which is a rebel militia that was led by Charles Taylor, who eventually became the president, but then was indicted by the UN Special Court for Sierra Leone. So all of this stuff is kind of bizarre here. This guy was the target, it sounds like. 4 masked men, I assume they're men, I don't want to presume their gender, go and break into the house. He ends up dead, trying to get help from neighboring houses. It sounds like it was quite a bloodied scene by all accounts. But the thing that I found fascinating about this is no one knows where the guy, how the guy ended up in London, why he was there. His address was apparently in Toronto, and that in and of itself raises other questions. There was a story in Maclean's a decade ago written about this by Michael Petro, who's a journalist, and he spent a considerable amount of time trying to get to the bottom of this. And Michael had tweeted something out on June 22nd that after pretty much a decade, this guy's application for permanent residency was still unresolved. So as of February 10th, the judicial entry here says that no decision has been rendered on the applicant's application for permanent residence. It was transferred back and forth to different departments. This document was filed, that document was filed. But 10 years after concerns were raised about this guy being in Canada and being an alleged war criminal, Canada could not and did not deal with that, did not deport him. There was very little information about it, about who was living here. And I'm not an expert in West African coups. I'm not an expert in Liberian politics. But I know that when someone is connected with war crimes, it should take perhaps a little bit less time than a decade to figure out what's happening and hold them to account. Michael Petro has written another piece in the Globe and Mail here, and he's written some stuff on Twitter about it, effectively saying that justice cannot and will not be served now because of what happened to this man. And the problem with that is that there has been ample time and ample opportunity. And this is not a failing of Justin Trudeau. I think the Conservative government has to bear the brunt of this as well. There's another case that the Conservatives have failed to have any action on, and the Liberals have failed to have any action on, with a former Nazi who put up roots in Kitchener-Waterloo area. And again, it was just back and forth in the courts. And the fact that a country cannot manage to get a war criminal out of its borders in a decade is an absolute farce. How can you take any other border security seriously when someone you know, whose past you know, however they got in, it's a part that we don't know, or at least isn't public, but we know who he is. Sounds like they knew where he was. How can that not be dealt with? And it's such a shame. And a country that can't protect its borders is a country that can't really protect much of anything. We've got to take a break. When we come back, more of the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North.
You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show. There's been a huge case going on in British Columbia for the last decade, a landmark case that really will determine in many respects what rights patients have to access healthcare outside of going through the government monopoly. And this case has been just mired in back and forth, protracted litigation, and now another question that's being raised about whether Canadians have a right to learn how much the government has spent fighting this, given how long it's taking. This is an appeal that's going before the court in British Columbia today. It's the Canadian Constitution Foundation that'll be making oral arguments at the BC Court of Appeal. The CCF's Director of Litigation, Christine Van Geyn, joins me on the line now. Christine, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So I want to talk about the oral arguments that are going to be today, and also a bit later on about the broader aspects of this case, because I've been covering it for what seems like years now, which just reminds us of how long this thing's been going on. Why is the question of how much the government's been spending important?
So the Cambia litigation's been going on for over a decade, and the cost of litigation, even a short amount of litigation is expensive. If you're going to be litigating for 10 years, it's a fortune. And this fortune is something that the taxpayers and patients of British Columbia have paid for. And essentially, they're paying the government. The government is using their money to litigate against patients' own rights. And that's the right to access timely health care. Now, the nub of the question in today's appeal that's before the British Columbia Court of Appeal is whether the cost of the litigation, the 10 years of litigation, whether that cost is subject to solicitor-client privilege. And our argument is that to say that one global number, the total bill of 10 years of litigation, is privileged, stretches the concept of privilege beyond its reasonable and natural limits.
Yeah, and that's actually not all that surprising to me that, it doesn't seem all that radical a concept. I know in other cases, through access to information, total bills have been disclosed by government, especially at the federal level. I've seen this, so I don't know why in BC it would have to be this state secret.
Well, I think it's always a fact-specific analysis. So there are things that could be disclosed by the mere disclosure of a bill. For example, the mere disclosure of a consultation with a family lawyer could reveal that you've been consulting with a family lawyer and maybe considering divorce. That's why things like that are subject to solicitor-client privilege. But the total number of 10 years of litigation, which we know the government has said is a very important case to them. We know they've called many, many experts. It's been going on for a long time, and it's extremely hard fought. We know that this bill is huge. We know it's important. What possible communications could we glean from seeing whether the number the government has spent is $8 million or $20 million? We can't get any information from that. And to say that that's privileged would mean that what is normally, almost a routine disclosure of documents to the public through access to information legislation, that routine disclosure in the public interest could stop if this new precedent is set today. And taxpayers deserve to know how much the government is spending when they're litigating against the public's own interest.
Not that it matters, because obviously the cost is the cost, and whether a lawyer is in-house or from another firm, they still have to be paid. But do we know if the government's been relying exclusively on its own Justice Department lawyers here, or have they contracted out to firms in this?
I can't answer that question. I mean, yesterday was my first day, so I don't know all of the ins and outs of 10 years worth of litigation. But what I can tell you is that they have retained a huge number of experts, and there are a huge number of expert reports, and that there have been many, many motions and sort of in between what are called interlocutory motions in the middle of this litigation. It's been going on for 10 years, and it's only just concluded its trial.
Yeah, and speaking in general terms, not in this case, I've seen in other cases that I've read and looked at how some of these expert reports can cost tens of thousands of dollars to produce. You're paying people a lot of money to do them, not to mention travel and all of that. So each individual report is expensive. And if you're talking about multiple reports, that adds up.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are really high profile people that have written these reports. And the trial alone went on for over 100 days. So we know that it's expensive. And the real reason the government is objecting, in our opinion, is not because they believe that this number is privileged. It's because they believe this number is embarrassing. And it's embarrassing for politicians when they spend millions and potentially tens of millions of taxpayer dollars fighting against the right to choose how you're going to access healthcare.
Yeah, and let's actually talk about that, because oftentimes these cases tend to detract attention from the broader questions that are being asked, the question that was the focus of that 100-day trial. What is at stake in this case?
So the Canby litigation, that's the bigger trial, the bigger case. It has been going on for a long time, as I said. The question is essentially, does the government have a right to restrict patients from buying private health insurance and restrict doctors from practicing in both private and government-run healthcare institutions? So I'm not sure if your listeners would be aware or not, but there have been private surgical clinics operating in British Columbia without problem for more than 20 years. And those clinics exist in part to give priority access to people who are injured in the workplace and are given special treatment through what would be British Columbia's WSIB, their equivalent of WSIB. And the physicians who run those clinics also offer surgical procedures to patients who would like to pay for their surgery because, they might not want to wait for 6 months, 9 months, 2 years, sometimes 4 to 5 years for certain types of procedures. And it's our position, and it's the plaintiff's position in the Canby litigation that you have a charter right to access healthcare. You have a charter right to life, liberty, and security of person. And if the government is going to say that you are only able to access healthcare through government channels, those channels are not working, and they're leaving patients in pain, sick, and in some cases permanently disabled or even dying on wait lists.
Is the case just about a patient's right to access the care, or also a doctor's right to provide it? Or does it have to be an either or are both really being litigated?
Really, what the specific question being asked is there a right for private medical insurance, and is there should the prohibition on private medical insurance be struck down, and should the prohibition on doctors having what's called dual practice, which is practicing in private clinics and in the public system, should that prohibition be struck down? And we argue that both should be struck down.
And I would assume that something of this nature is destined to go to the Canadian Supreme Court anyway, but obviously it has to go through at the provincial level before it gets there. Do we have much or any precedent elsewhere in Canada on these questions, on basically the public healthcare monopoly?
Yeah, so there's actually a very famous precedent from Quebec in a case about 15 years ago called Chioli. And in Chioli, the government found that the Quebec prohibition on private insurance was violating patients' rights to life, liberty, and security of person under Section 7 because it was leaving many patients languishing on these wait lists. So the question before the British Columbia courts is similar. We just have that added prohibition on the dual practice. And really the dual practice prohibition, it's a practical consequence. If a doctor is prohibited from operating in a private clinic because they would like to have public hospital surgical care, they really can't survive only operating in private clinics. Doctors need hospital access, and they need that. And it's also part of the way many physicians view their public role is to provide access in the public system as well.
And as I understand it, with doctors like, for example, at the Canby Center, they've got these ORs, and you've got a doctor that isn't serving a workplace injury at that particular time. They're not taking anything away from the public system by adding a private service on top of the work they're already doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things a lot of people don't know is that many physicians who do operate in the public system don't get the number of operating room days that they would like.
Yeah, the care is rationed. That's a huge problem, especially in Ontario.
So we have some physicians who would like to operate, 100 days a year, and they are given 20 operating days. And some of these are physicians who have really small subspecialties and 4-year wait lists. And if you would like, and the patients aren't wealthy, the patients just really feel desperately that they need these surgeries. And that's why they're willing to to pay in order to access care that the government is not providing them. And you can't tell a patient who's suffering, you need to continue to suffer because of some type of political dogma about our view of the public health care system in Canada.
Yeah, and that's a very good way of putting it, because in a lot of cases, I find that that ironclad grip on the public healthcare monopoly is really preserving this ideal more than it's preserving any functional effect.
Yeah, and no one is arguing that there should be should be a dismantling of the public system. We're just arguing that, and we're just supporting this litigation. We're not actually an intervener or plaintiff. We're just supporting this particular piece of litigation. And everyone supports the public system and wants the public system to remain in place. What we're saying is that clinics that have existed for 20 years that are helping patients access care instead of waiting on wait lists, and give physicians the opportunity to use their time in a way that helps the public instead of, just sitting at home or doing more consultations for patients they can't operate on. That's in the public interest. That protects people's protection for their life, liberty, and security of person.
Canadian Constitution Foundation Litigation Director Christine Van Geyn joining me on the line. Christine, great to talk to you again. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks. Happy to talk to you anytime, Andrew.
That does it for us for today. My thanks to Christine Van Geyn and all of you for tuning into the show. We'll be back next week with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is The Andrew Lawton Show here on True North.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.